Laurel Canyon wasn't always synonymous with music, counterculture, or cultural rebellion. Yet between the mid-1960s and the early 1970s, an unusually high number of influential bands and musicians emerged from this one small area of Laurel Canyon. Prior to the 1960s, Laurel Canyon and Los Angeles more broadly were not known for their music scene. For much of American history, it was New York that was regarded as the center of American music. So the question many people have asked since is a simple one. Why Laurel Canyon? With that in mind, let's begin with the place itself. Laurel Canyon is a mountainous neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills. It has limited road access and was originally inhabited by the Tongva people, a Native American tribe indigenous to the area. The canyon sits adjacent to Lookout Mountain, a detail that becomes much more interesting when you consider that the mountain was once home to a military installation known as Lookout Mountain Air Force Station. Originally used as a World War II air defense site, the facility later became one of the most secretive film production centers in the United States. Up until 1969, it produced motion pictures and photographs for the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission. Over its lifetime, the site processed more than 19,000 classified motion pictures and employed hundreds of filmmakers with top-secret clearance. Among those who worked on projects at the facility were figures such as John Ford, Ronald Reagan, Walt Disney, and Marilyn Monroe. Both military and intelligence personnel were known to operate out of the base, all within direct proximity to Laurel Canyon. Alright, so before I go any further, I do think that it's worth noting that we have this small isolated little canyon, and right beside it there's a military facility producing films for the United States government, classified films at that. Whatever conclusions people come to at the end of this broadcast, there's no denying that that is a striking overlap. Anyway, let's continue. By 1965, a new scene was beginning to take shape in Laurel Canyon. Musicians, singers and songwriters were starting to congregate there, and these were not obscure figures. Many would go on to become some of the most influential artists of the 1960s and 70s, including Jim Morrison, David Crosby and John Phillips. We'll return to these individuals later on. While this new music scene was beginning to gain traction, opposition to the Vietnam War was already well established in the United States. In later decades, the anti-war movement would become closely associated with hippie culture. However, in its early stages, the movement looked very different. It largely consisted of college students, veterans, clergy, and working-class Americans who opposed the war on political or moral grounds. The psychedelic aesthetic that would later symbolize the movement had not yet fully emerged. That aesthetic shift begins to take shape in and around the Laurel Canyon music scene. By the late 1960s, the image of opposition to the Vietnam War had changed dramatically. What began as a politically serious movement had increasingly become associated with music, fashion, and unfortunately, drugs. Okay, so this is where things start to get a bit complicated. On one hand, we have a serious political movement that is staunchly against the Vietnam War, and on the other hand, we have this new music scene gaining traction in Laurel Canyon. This is all happening within a very short space of time, mind you, and these two movements became overlapped. So I guess the question is, was this organic, was it encouraged, or was it orchestrated? Anyway, let's keep going. To understand how this aesthetic transformation took hold, it's worth looking more closely at a figure named Vito Paulikas and the group that gathered around him. Vito Paulikas was born on the 20th of May 1913 and was originally from Lawrence, Massachusetts. Little is known about his childhood. However, in 1938 he was convicted of armed robbery and given a 25-year sentence after a botched movie theatre hold-up. 4 years after being given this sentence, he was released into the United States Merchant Marines. In 1946, he made his way to Los Angeles and worked as an artist and a sculptor. An interesting side note is that he was the cousin of Bobo Rockefeller, a member of the incredibly rich and powerful banking dynasty. By the time the Laurel Canyon music scene was in its origins, Vito and his wife Sue were the leaders of a loose group of dancers called the Freaks. The Freaks were known for their flamboyant clothing, uninhibited dancing, and a theatrical style. Paulicas and his dancers began frequenting clubs and bars where the up-and-coming Laurel Canyon musicians were performing. The Freaks were allowed access to the clubs free of charge, as their radical dancing and fashion drew curious patrons into the venues. In the early days, it's safe to say that the Freaks drew the crowds more so than the Laurel Canyon musicians did. According to Barry Miles, author of the book Hippie, he states that the Freaks were by all counts the very first hippies. As the Laurel Canyon musicians and bands quickly grew in popularity, so too did the hippie aesthetic. When many of these bands openly declared anti-war stances and released protest songs, we can see why the anti-war movement, as it was, and this new Laurel Canyon hippie scene began to overlap. Fans who adopted the look were also absorbing the politics, and a serious protest movement gradually became intertwined with hippie culture. Alright, so before we move on, I think it's worth just pausing for a minute. None of this stuff on its own proves any kind of grand conspiracy or orchestration, but it does raise some eyebrows. So you have to bear in mind Laurel Canyon, up until this point, was never known as a musical centre. It was a random canyon which just happened to be directly beside a military facility. And all of a sudden you have this cultural explosion, this musical and cultural explosion. And this new movement becomes completely intertwined with a completely different movement, the anti-war movement, which was unfolding across the country. So much so that now, in popular memory, the hippie movement is actually remembered much more so than the political opposition that came before it. Anyway, now that we've laid out the background of the canyon and the climate of the time, it's worth looking more closely at some of the musicians who emerged from the Laurel Canyon scene. One of the most iconic figures to come out of it was Jim Morrison. Morrison was the son of George Stephen Morrison, a career United States naval officer who would rise to the rank of admiral. Morrison Sr. is most closely associated with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an event later shown to be based on exaggerated claims which helped to kickstart the Vietnam War. This led to the deaths of millions. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Morrison showed little to no interest in music. He couldn't read or write music, and he didn't play an instrument. Despite this, he arrived on the scene with a fully formed stage persona and a collection of songs that, by several accounts, appeared in a very short space of time. Neither Morrison nor his bandmates had prior experience performing in a band, and early live shows were reportedly subpar. By all appearances, the Doors were simply four young men who came together to perform music written by a singer with no formal music background. Despite this, they would go on to become one of the most influential bands of their era. Morrison's background and rapid rise were unusual, and as it turns out, not entirely unique. One of the most successful bands to emerge from the Laurel Canyon scene was the Byrds, and one of their central figures was founding member David Crosby. Like Jim Morrison, Crosby came from a background connected to powerful institutions. His father, Floyd Crosby, was a respected cinematographer who had served in the US Army during World War I. He later worked extensively in Hollywood. There has also been speculation that Floyd Crosby had ties to US military intelligence, although this has never been verified. In In their early days, the Byrds were not accomplished musicians. Like the Doors, they struggled with their instruments and relied heavily on image and presentation during live performances. During this formative period, the Byrds were closely connected to Vito Porlacas and the Freaks, whose presence in clubs and venues helped generate attention and draw crowds. Once again, we see a familiar pattern emerge: limited early musical ability, connections to powerful institutions, rapid exposure, and proximity to the same small social circle operating in Laurel Canyon. Another prominent figure to emerge from the Laurel Canyon scene was John Phillips, often referred to as Papa John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Phillips was raised by his stepfather, Claude Phillips, a US Marine Corps officer and engineer. As a teenager, he attended elite military preparatory schools in Washington, D.C. He was later offered an appointment to the US Naval Academy at Annapolis, an opportunity that he did not pursue. Phillips later married Susie Adams, a direct descendant of John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States. At the height of the Cuban Revolution, Phillips traveled to Havana, stating that he was a concerned citizen with the intention of supporting Fidel Castro, a claim that raised eyebrows considering his background and his connections. Within the Laurel Canyon scene, Phillips played a significant organizational role. He co-organized the Monterey Pop Festival, an event that brought unprecedented mainstream exposure to the emerging hippie culture. He also wrote the song San Francisco, which became an anthem of the movement, and it inspired thousands of young people to travel to San Francisco and immerse themselves in the scene. By now, certain similarities should be obvious. Before closing this section, I think it's worth examining one final figure associated with the Laurel Canyon scene. That figure is Frank Zappa. Zappa stands apart from many of his contemporaries. Unlike Crosby or Morrison, he was an accomplished and technically skilled musician from an early age. Zappa's father, Francis Sr., was a chemical warfare specialist who worked at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, a highly classified military research facility. Edgewood would later become associated with controversial human experimentation and mind control research. Zappa spent part of his childhood living in close proximity to this environment. During his time in Laurel Canyon, Zappa lived in a large residence known as the Log Cabin, a sprawling property with an unusually large communal space that became a regular gathering point for musicians and artists passing through the canyon. Visitors later described unusual features on the grounds, including caves and tunnels adding to the property's mystique. Zappa's wife, Gail, also shared an unlikely personal overlap with the scene. She attended the same naval kindergarten as Jim Morrison. While this may be a coincidence, it is just another example of the small, tightly connected world that characterized Laurel Canyon at the time. Perhaps more strikingly, despite being a central figure within the Laurel Canyon ecosystem, Zappa was openly critical of hippie culture. He later stated that he despised it and expressed views that were broadly pro-military. And yet paradoxically, he operated the log cabin as a communal space frequented by the very people he claimed to reject. This contradiction alone raises questions. Alright, let's quickly do a recap of what we have here. When we look at these people side by side, and there's many others who fit the same profile who I haven't mentioned, it's really hard not to notice the similarities. You've got multiple musicians emerging from the same small canyon, all of them with military or institutional backgrounds, most of them with little to no musical experience, and all of them rising very quickly as the counterculture explodes. Then you've got someone like Frank Zappa, openly pro-military, military background, and openly critical of the scene. Despite this, then, he's right there in the middle of it, hosting people and helping to shape the environment as a whole. All the while this is happening, this is in a location that just happens to sit directly beside Lookout Mountain, a top secret military facility. Again, it doesn't prove a grand conspiracy, but it does make the idea of this being a completely organic movement a lot harder to swallow. Anyway, let's continue. In a darker turn, one of the most infamous figures to pass through the Laurel Canyon scene was none other than Charles Manson. Manson came into contact with several of the scene's biggest stars and most prominent figures. In 1968, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys hosted Manson and members of his group for a short period of time. Manson also recorded demo tracks in Brian Wilson's studio, and Neil Young, who was allegedly present, would reportedly describe Manson as a living poet. Prior to entering this environment, Manson had spent much of his life incarcerated. By the age of 32, he had spent over half of his life in prisons and reform institutions. During this time, he immersed himself in books on influence and persuasion, as well as psychology, hypnosis, and even Scientology. When he was released from prison in 1967, he emerged directly into the counterculture scene and the summer of love. Manson used the skills he had learned in prison to charm and exert influence over young and impressionable people. He was older than most of his followers and positioned himself as a guru-type figure who surrounded himself with young and often underage women. By 1969, less than 2 years after his release from prison, members of Manson's group carried out the Tate LaBianca murders, killing 7 people. These events served as a symbolic end for the counterculture movement. The same year that had celebrated its ideals with iconic events such as Woodstock, had also exposed its darkest excesses. Public sentiment towards the hippie movement shifted sharply and permanently. Alright, so before I move into the conclusion of this video, I just briefly want to go over the sheer number of bizarre oddities surrounding Laurel Canyon. So, to quickly recap, we have a small isolated canyon which is located beside a military base that's being used to produce classified motion pictures for the government. Despite having no musical history, it's suddenly an artistic hotspot for up-and-coming musicians, many of whom have familial connections to the US military and intelligence agencies. These musicians go on to become some of the most defining artists of their generations. The hippie movement also spawns in tandem with this music scene, and largely hijacks a previously very respectable anti-war movement. This movement and its artists are promoted relentlessly by the mainstream, despite being apparently anti-war. And all the while this is happening, Charles Manson is rubbing shoulders with many of the central figures in this movement. The movement then dies a symbolic death after Manson and his group commit a series of brutal murders. Now that everything is laid out, let's get into some theories about what was going on. The main theory surrounding Laurel Canyon is that the 1960s counterculture was not entirely organic. According to this view, the US military and intelligence establishment deliberately shaped a cultural movement that would ultimately neutralize and discredit the growing anti-war movement. This theory suggests that this was done by placing the children of military and intelligence personnel at the forefront of the scene, using music and radical hippie aesthetics as the delivery system. While these artists often expressed anti-war sentiments on the surface, they also promoted hedonism, rebellion, drug use, and sexual liberation. As a result, the anti-war movement became increasingly associated with a lifestyle that ordinary Americans found alienating and irresponsible. It is worth noting that many early anti-war activists openly criticized the hippies and believed their presence did more harm than good. As the movement became synonymous with long hair, drugs, and free love, public sympathy for the opposition to the war began to erode. More extreme versions of the theory focus on the role of the nearby Lookout Mountain facility. Some believe it was used not only for classified film production, but also for MK Ultra era psychological experiments, and that the Laurel Canyon music scene was influenced through subliminal messaging and behavioral manipulation. Theorists claim that figures like Vito Paulikas and Charles Manson were tools within this process and that they were both connected to intelligence agencies. Paulikas and his group were used to help establish the aesthetic and social tone of the movement, while Manson and his group were used as the mechanism to symbolically and violently end the movement. In Manson's case, some theorists argue that he himself may have been subjected to mind control experimentation, while others believe that he consciously played a role that had already been written for him. Alright, so I'm going to finish up with my own thoughts. After looking into all of this, personally, I don't buy that Laurel Canyon was some random organic cultural explosion. I think that there's too many bizarre coincidences and strange overlaps. What are the odds that so many of the biggest and most influential bands of the era had members that had military and intelligence connections? There's more than just the four who I named, and if I was to go into all of them, we'd probably be here for hours. Also, what are the odds that this random canyon, which was never known as any kind of musical hub, randomly produces some of the biggest bands of all time, all at the same time? And it just so happens to be right beside a secret military base. I mean, there's only so many coincidences that you could take before this all begins to look very shady. To me, the claims put forth by the people who push the Laurel Canyon conspiracy theory are very compelling. And I wouldn't be one bit surprised if many of the claims that they put forth in this theory turned out to be true. Anyway, this video's been long enough. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I got most of my information from Dave McGowan's book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Quick word of warning, this book has an enormous amount of information in it, far more than what was presented in this video, and it is a challenging read. McGowan's a good author, but he presents the information in a very journalistic fashion, so you really have to pay attention because it can be quite hard to keep up with where he's going with each of his threads. If you enjoyed this video and you made it to the end, I just want to say thank you. Please consider dropping a like and a subscribe. It'll really help get this channel off the ground. I have much more content in mind which I want to make, and the quality is going to keep improving. I'm starting to find my flow a little bit now, and I aim to keep going. So until next time, take care.